So I'm Susan Reynolds. I am the co-founder of Lookup, and so pleased to see everybody here for Your Brain on Social Media, featuring Gen Z activists and their allies. And this is so important that we work together across generations to solve some of the issues we're seeing around the mental health crisis among youth, among teens, among college students. So that's what we're here to do today. And I am really happy to present and our co-sponsors. So we have the director of the Children's Screen Time Action Network, Jean Rogers, who will be speaking to you at the end, as well as the Social Dilemma's impact producer, Julia Hoppock, who will actually take this away. But Julia has been working with the Social Dilemma and working with the exposure labs to really take the information that the audience gleans from the Social Dilemma and put it into action. And so that's what she's going to do with us here today, is help us learn the issues from our panelists and put it into action. So Julia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan and Lookup, for co-sponsoring this event today. I'm really excited to be here. It's a really important conversation, which is coming not only at the tail end of Mental Health Awareness Month, but also as we slowly emerge from the collective isolation brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's really a critical time to be checking in on our mental health. And that is something that should never be for sale. But unfortunately, as the Social Dilemma showed us, our mental health is being monetized. Big Social's business model is built to keep its users on their platforms at all costs, employing persuasive design techniques to keep us scrolling, liking, and sharing content served up to us by algorithms that track and monitor our behavior. This is all happening in the context of a broader mental health crisis in this country. A Pew Research study found that the total number of teenagers who recently experienced depression rose by 59% between 2007 and 2017. So this issue has probably never felt more urgent, but the spotlight on it has also never been brighter, due in large part because of the kinds of youth activists and adult allies that are on our panel today. So with that, I'd love to start out by introducing our panelists. I'll start with our panel of Gen Z activists. So I'll start by introducing Eliza Copans. And just give a wave just in case you're not spotlighted, Eliza, but Eliza is a digital wellness youth activist, rising freshman at Brown University, and a founding member of Lookup's Teen Leadership Council. She also offers a youth perspective on the board of the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood's Action Network, where she co-authored Dear Parents, Messages from Tech-Wise Teens. Hannah Chung is a high school student and the founder of On Our Terms, which is a multimedia campaign by youth for youth, intended to increase digital literacy. She's also a Lookup social innovator and a winner of the Social Dilemma grant competition, which spotlights young people who are realigning technology for the public good. Lars Bjork is a student athlete and co-founder of the Chase Bjork Foundation, whose mission is to empower adolescents, families, and communities in learning about, discussing, and taking action on brain health. Maddie Freeman is a student and Lookup social innovator, who, after experiencing countless suicides in her community in Colorado, started the No So November Challenge, which challenges high school students to log off social media for a month to assess how it impacts their health, their mental health. And finally, to our adult allies, we have Bob Wigley, and Bob backs young entrepreneurs in the cutting edge tech businesses and chairs UK Finance. He's also the author of Born Digital, the story of a distracted generation, which presents a roadmap for society to radically reset its relationship with technology for the sake of future generations. And then finally, we have Jon Gedney with us today, and he's an impact producer for MTV News and a leading expert on today's national youth political movements. His coverage of youth movements shaping US politics at MTV News has helped activists end facial recognition in schools, elevate Indigenous rights, and protect the 2020 election. So I don't know about you, but I'm very excited because we have really an all-star lineup of panelists here today. And I'd like to start with our Gen Z activists, many of whom have personal and powerful stories that brought them to this issue. So I'd love to ask all of you why you got involved. And Eliza, I'll start with you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. And Julia, thank you for the introduction. My name is Aliza Kopans, and as Julia said, I'm a rising freshman at Brown University, and I'm wrapping up my senior year here in Boston. And in the fall of my junior year of high school, I attended the Mountain School, which is a semester school program in Vermont, and I went 4 months without my phone. And during this time, I had the first opportunity since elementary school to form relationships with my peers without having screens as a means of communication and breaking the ice. I was really excited to enter a space in which that was the case and where I would be able to form these genuine human connections without all of the layers and filters that social media and texting in the digital space add. And the real culture shock for me wasn't moving to rural, middle of nowhere Vermont, but it was returning to my large suburban public school and realizing how dependent my peers and then myself, once in that environment again, were on our devices. And I think that's when I really noticed this need for a change. And just a couple months later, COVID struck and we were tied to our devices for safety reasons. And since then, I've worked with Campaign for Commercial Free Childhood and Look Up and found a wonderful community among these amazing activists in the digital wellness space, really working to move towards a human, not screen-focused world and prioritize the health and well-being of everybody over the profit of these large tech companies.
Great. Thank you so much, Eliza. That's very, very impressive. And I'd love to ask Hannah the same question. Why did you get involved in this issue?
Thank you, Julia, for the introduction. My name is Hannah Chung. I'll be attending Northeastern University as a freshman in the fall. To me, declining mental health is a symptom of capitalism, which happens to be a consequence of classism, which are all tools to keep white supremacy and imperialism intact. And as someone who's been used as a pawn in these regimes of power, how could I not be an activist? Not to mention my personal experiences in predominantly white institutions have all been about preserving my identity and somehow proving myself. Pertaining to surveillance capitalism in particular, I've seen how damaging tropes in media, such as the Dragon Lady, the China doll, and the Jezebel, as well as racist algorithms, worked in conjunction to instigate violence towards communities of color and women in particular. Just a couple of months ago, the fetishization and sexualization of East Asian women led to 9 women being murdered in massage parlors across our country, and we still fail to denounce the systems of power that enable the violence of white supremacy. I work to disrupt and dismantle the Euro-hetero patriarchally capitalist conquest of the world. I know it's a mouthful, and I believe that we must actively fight for the liberation of all communities of color in order to do that.
Thank you, Hannah. I don't know, Hannah Chung for president. All right, so I'd love to ask the same question to Lars. What sparked your interest in this issue and what brought you here today?
So thank you for introducing me. Hi, my name is Lars. I'm a junior at Concord Carlisle High School. And tragically, last year, my brother died from suicide just before the pandemic hit. My family watched him suffer for over a year and didn't know what was happening. And he ended up going from diagnosis to death in just 3 weeks. Through the traumatic event, watching a brother suffer and losing a brother the way I did triggered a call to action for myself and my family to make a change. So we wanted to do something that would make Chase proud and help others. We started a foundation in his name called the Lars Bjork Foundation with a goal of promoting awareness and education about mental health among adolescents, families, and the communities they live in.
Thank you so much, Lars, for sharing your story, and sorry for your loss, but also inspired by how you've turned that into activism. So Maddie, I'd love to turn to you and just hear from you about why you got involved in this issue.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. My name is Maddie Freeman. I'm going to be a sophomore at CU Boulder next year. Lars, thank you so much for sharing your story. I have a similar story, though I was not impacted in my family by suicide, which I am very lucky for. But through the course of my high school years, I lost a lot of friends to suicide. Kind of hard to quantify because there was a lot in our community, but I would say like 4 close friends of mine and like 9 other mutual friends. It was just death after death after death, and it really impacted not only me, but my community in a huge way. And I knew I needed to like step in and do something about it. So I kind of shifted my focus towards mental health and suicide prevention in my old school district. Which then after watching the documentary, The Social Dilemma, I really realized the kind of niche collision of mental health and social media together. And that was kind of when I knew that I needed to try to create something that would combat both of those issues at once, because I've seen how linked they are. And like I've said before, I wouldn't say, most of the time I wouldn't say people commit suicide because of social media, but I can see a clear link, and I can see how social media contributes to mental health issues that are already there. And so, yeah, the reason I am here is because of all the people I have lost, and I know that they would have wanted this same thing to be happening, to have all of us youth who have experienced this issue to kind of do something about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you so much for sharing. And I'm also really sorry for your losses. Just hearing these stories today, I know I've heard them before, and they've really troubled me and inspired me just in the ways that you guys are taking this into action. So I'd love to turn to our adult allies who have been looking into this problem for a long time, as I'm sure they're also affected by hearing all of this. Bob, I have a question for you. I know that you've interviewed over 200 young people and distilled mountains of the available research on this subject while writing your book, Born Digital. What is your biggest takeaway about what the problem is?
So my biggest takeaway is that in the 10 years that these technologies have become ubiquitous in our lives, in every aspect of our lives, adolescent well-being has declined. And I don't want to blast you with statistics, but I do want to give you 5 or 6 from the 515 different references in my book, which illustrate, I think, some of what we've just heard from these wonderful panelists. So one of the most striking statistics was 54% of Gen Z interviewed in a recent survey said that if their parents really knew what went on social media, they'd be even more worried than they are. The Children's Society, which is a UK charity that's been doing a survey of children's happiness for 25 years, concluded last year that children's unhappiness is at an all-time low, partly due to excessive social media use, and 60% of Gen Z interviewed said that they were both dependent on social media and that their reliance made them unhappy. Half of schools tell us they think the internet is bad for young people's mental health. We know that teenagers who are heavy social media users have a 27% higher risk of depression, and those that spend 5 hours a day or more on devices are 70% more likely to have a suicide risk factor than those who spend an hour or less. And 80% of children in a recent survey said they'd had a potentially harmful experience online in the preceding 12 months. 55% of that was exposure to inappropriate content. 2 other quick things, or 3 things actually, if I may: sleep, gaming, and porn. So 80% of Gen Z tell us that they use their phone immediately before they go to sleep. That's led the World Health Organization pre-COVID to describe the situation we're facing as a global sleep loss epidemic. Why is that important? Well, because every major disease in the developed world has a major causal link to deficient sleep. Just on gaming, the World Health Organization designated excessive gaming as an illness in 2017. Why is that a problem? Well, unfortunately, a series of studies have concluded that the more time that we spend gaming, the less well kids do at school, and they read on average 30% less. Reading is now actually at its lowest level ever recorded, according to the National Literacy Trust. Why is that concerning? Because reading for pleasure is the single biggest indicator of a child's future success, ahead, extraordinarily, of family circumstances, parental education background, or income. And then finally, just on porn. So we know in the UK, at least, that the average porn start age is about 11. A third of British boys say that they're now considered what we call heavy porn users. That's defined by them as watching more than they can count. And picking up on some of the things that a couple of the panelists mentioned here, why is porn so bad? Well, it exacerbates gender and race stereotypes. It leads to objectification, negative body issues, performance anxiety, depression, eating disorders, a whole range of issues. So I don't want to blast you with stats, but there are a few that I think we should all be focusing on. The good news from the 200 interviews with the youngsters is they recognize the concept of digital overload. They have developed some techniques themselves to detox. They are very keen to solve the problems that the internet is creating. And I think activists like the ones on this panel working with adults can really create some fantastic solutions to the problems that we've identified.
Great. Thank you, Bob. I'm glad you brought us back up on a hopeful note. Those are some troubling stats indeed. And John, I know that as part of its coverage of Mental Health Awareness Month, MTV News also looked into this issue and how social media is impacting people's mental health. What did you find?
Yeah, so I mean, we interviewed dozens of teens over the course of about 2 months on a bit of a fact-finding mission ahead of Mental Health Awareness Month. And a lot of it tracks, all of it tracks with what Bob was just saying, but I can say there were pretty quickly, there were a couple of universal patterns that emerge. And by universal, I mean like 100% of the kids we talked to reported the same experience. So the first one, I'll talk about three, but the first big two, or the two big ones were the quantification of popularity and social comparison. Comparing yourself is totally normal. It's automatic behavior. It's very human. We do it all the time. There are two types of social comparison. There's upward comparison, where you're comparing yourself to people you think are a little bit better off than you. And then there's downward comparison, which is where you're comparing yourself to people who you perceive to be not as well off as you. Social media, and upward comparison is worse for your mental health. Social media just tends to entail a lot more upward comparison. And the reason for that is because everyone is sort of promoting an idealized version of themselves online, in part because that's what performs better. It's aspirational content. And that can be really bad for young people's self-esteem in particular. But what's really interesting about this, and we also dove into the research around this as well to back up what the kids we were interviewing were telling us. What's really interesting is that it's not so much the content of the posts that people are comparing themselves to. It's the quantification of popularity on those posts. It's the metrics that are assigned to these posts. It's things like followers and likes and comments. And when you think about it, there's no real reason for those metrics, right? Like, you're not walking around offline with a tattoo on your face saying, I've got, 600 friends or whatever in normal social interactions. The only reason those metrics are there are to gamify the apps and to keep you coming back. And so this is what creates this loop, of addiction and self-esteem issues, which brings me to the second thing that keeps coming up over and over and over again. Once you're stuck in this loop of addiction and shame and comparison, this creates like the perfect environment for advertisers to start manipulating your thoughts and your opinions and your behaviors. And so, as we saw in The Social Dilemma, and as others have written about, they're not just tracking and predicting our behaviors anymore, they're actually trying to engineer them so they can sell certainty to advertisers. So a big question among teens, and I was talking to Hannah Chung a few weeks ago about this. She put it very well. She was like, how, as young people, the whole shtick is figuring out who you are in this world. How can you have any control over the person you're becoming or trust the person you're becoming if increasingly your thoughts, behaviors, and emotions are being engineered by corporate interests you can't even see? So those would be the two big ones. That I think were universal among students that we talked to.
Yeah, thank you so much for all that information. It's really fascinating and frightening. And you're absolutely right that it's not just tracking our behavior, but predicting it. And as you're developing, especially as a teen, what does that really mean? So yeah, these are really interesting points. And MTV News has done some great coverage on this. I encourage you to check it out. But yeah, I want to go back. I mean, I was so inspired by your personal stories with the youth activists on this panel. And I wanted to turn it over to Lars and Maddie to start. You both have suffered unimaginable loss. I know many young people across the country, and perhaps even in this audience, have also suffered. Lars, I'd love to start with you. I'm just wondering if you have any advice for young people who are hurting.
Yeah, so I do have some advice. I know when I lost my brother, I was going through a great deal of pain, and the things that I found comfort in, for example, are taking walks. I think that walking really helps you connect with nature and helps you think through things. I also find that exercise, I happen to play sports, and I find that working out or exercise of any kind really calms my mind. Creativity as well. painting or gardening or just doing creative art is really helpful. And then I also think spending time with family or just loved ones, because they know what's best for you, and they know you better than anyone else. And along with that, just finding things to be grateful for. So I know when you're hurting, it's easy to focus on negative aspects of life, but what's hard and what is the most beneficial is to focus on all of the positive things you have in your life. And then lastly, I also think that healing through action is a really good way to make yourself heal. I think that helping others will help you. And so doing deeds of kindness, such as saying hi to someone you don't know or supporting others who may be struggling, will help support you. So, yeah.
Awesome. I cannot agree more. Spreading kindness and love and through action is an incredible piece of advice for healing. I would definitely agree with that. And some of my pieces of advice, especially for those struggling specifically with loss or grief, I always say, like, healing is not linear. Grief is very tricky and hard, and it's really important to be gentle with yourself and accept the complex emotions as they come, and not to judge your thoughts, because it's such a complicated, hard thing to deal with. I personally try to always seek out the people I've lost in my day-to-day life and see them through signs, because they let you know that they're still here with you, because I personally believe that no one's ever fully gone. And I think that's a really cool way to kind of carry them with you. And just like he said, through action, I found a lot of solace through working on this project, knowing that they would have been right by my side, like working on this with me. And like, it's really important it's almost like you can take your pain and put it somewhere productive and healthy. And I think it's very important, just like with working out. And I also paint. These are some of my paintings behind me. That's something that's helped me a lot through the years of depression and anxiety. It's a wonderful thing to kind of express yourself, creativity. But I would just say my piece of advice I always used to tell myself is just get to tomorrow. Just make it through today and get through tomorrow. And if you tell yourself that every day, at some point you're going to make it, and you're going to feel so much better about yourself and be happy that you made it to the point you're at today. So those are my little nuggets of advice.
That's really beautiful. Thank you guys. And just so much wisdom coming from such young people. So I know that I'm taking some notes and will use a lot of this advice myself in my day-to-day. So thank you for sharing. And just hearing these stories, I think, helps us destigmatize the issue of mental health a lot. And Hannah, I know that you've talked before about how not only getting access to mental health resources, but even asking for help is particularly challenging in communities of color. Why do you think that is, and what should be done about it?
I kind of have seen the self-care industry being co-opted, I guess, and commodified by, I could say, the West. And I feel like it now kind of lacks like representation or general values to even uplift or support communities of color. And I know, like, based on personal experience, I've noticed language barriers, the fact that mental health discussions are really different amongst varying cultures, the fact that this is a trend I've seen a lot in like immigrant families in particular, but just time, like for self-care. I know many parents work a lot of jobs to support their like children, and they're kind of sacrificing self-care to like keep their families going. And so the general trend I've noticed is that self-care, I guess, can be a privilege. And just personally, I thought it was really hard to obtain even like therapists that kind of completely understand these generational traumas and systemic racism that POC are going through every day. So to answer your question, yes, the conversation of mental health is really different, I guess, amongst POC, but there are also the resources that like we kind of need but lack. And so I think what would be great if we see more BIPOC in this field that can better represent us and actually maybe share some of our own lived experiences to kind of eliminate the disconnect that I personally noticed when seeking for help.
Thank you so much for sharing, Hannah. I really appreciate your perspective, and I think there's a lot more work to be done to make this all more accessible to all of us. And Jon, I'd love to turn to you. You know, it seems like we're talking about this mental health issue, and part of the reason of stigmatizing it is, you know, really thinking of it more as a public health issue. So from a movement building perspective, why is it important that we frame this as a public health issue?
Yeah, and I want to start out by saying, I guess, the inclination when you hear about stuff like this is to take individual action. And that's very important to take, but I think there's an emerging understanding that individual action for systemic issues is not enough, right? It's kind of like saying we'll solve climate change if you stop using plastic straws. So when you think about movement building around this, and tackling some of the issues we talked about, including like quantified popularity and the free will issue and some of the other issues Bob brought up and everyone else has brought up. I'm going to quote from David Jay, who's the head of mobilization at the Center for Humane Technology. I interviewed him a couple of times in our own reporting about this, because my question was, how do you build a movement around this? Like, what does that look like? What would a successful movement look like? And he was like, the first thing that you need to understand is the normal way, the usual way that lawmakers try to regulate big tech or approach this problem is through three different lenses. It's antitrust, privacy laws, and then the third is Section 230, which has been in the news lately. And these are all important conversations to have, but they don't solve the root problem that we're all talking about today, which is that these apps, these platforms are literally making people sick and are literally killing people, or contributing to the teen suicide rates. So there is this emerging path to take this seriously as a public health crisis. And it's a really smart strategy for a couple of different reasons. The first is that it addresses the root problem, right? Like, you take this on as a public health crisis, you introduce legislation to ban quantified popularity, to put guardrails on manipulative marketing tactics. The other thing to know about this in terms of movement building is this is the one issue that Republicans and Democrats in Congress seem to see eye to eye on, right? Like, Section 230, for example, just because it's in the news lately, you know, there's a lot of interest on both sides to pursue Section 230 reform, but their reasons are diametrically opposed. So nothing is moving forward on Section 230. But there was a recent hearing in March where Republicans and Democrats both like railed against these tech CEOs about the impact that these platforms are having on young people's mental health. So if you want to build a movement around taking on big tech, this has a lot of support and a lot of allies in Congress. And then the third thing is just that this is something that young people can and have to lead on. Almost everyone here I've talked to, like Maddie, I think you and I spoke about this in depth last time we talked, but young people have the firsthand experience. They grew up on these platforms. The people in Congress and in the Senate that are responsible for regulating this, they didn't grow up with social media being so integral to their identity formation process. They have no idea. So the risk is that if young people are not at the table, we could get regulation that's well-intended but doesn't solve the issue. And then the last thing I'll just say on this front about young people leading is that Gen Z knows how to fix this. We've figured, Gen Z and millennials, I'll include myself in this by saying we, but like, especially over the past 4 years, we've built massive movements to tackle systemic issues, from climate change to gun violence to police brutality, right? Like, when we put our heads together and we identify there's a problem that we all share and we figure out a common language around it, we know how to move mountains like very, very quickly. So there are a lot of reasons to take this seriously as a public health issue in the current climate. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Jon. Very interesting to hear your take. We're also seeing momentum, talking about it as a public health issue. And you're absolutely right. It needs to be young people who lead this movement. And luckily enough, we have those young people on our panel today. So I'd love to turn it to them to talk a little bit about solutions that you all are working on. So Eliza, I'll start with you. I know you've done some work educating parents on how to talk to kids about this issue in the Dear Parents Guide. So what do parents need to know?
Thank you, Julia. So last summer, wonderful Celine and I co-created Dear Parents Resource, which is a resource from teens to parents about how we want to be approached regarding conversations around and agreements on screen time. And just as Jon said, the solution needs to come from those who are living the problem. And in this technological era, everybody is figuring it out at the same time. So as parents are working to guide their children to lead happy and healthy lives, both offline and online, they're figuring it out for themselves in these technological spaces. And so one of the biggest things that I think we all need to hold on to is that it's never too late to change how we are interacting with digital spaces, how parents are teaching their kids to interact with digital spaces, and the importance of listening and all of that, and understanding that your experience is unique to yourself, and there's also shared elements with everybody else. And so I think screen time conversations are frequently very heated. And even in my household, in which my parents really try to make that an open conversation, there have been yelling battles over whether I put my phone in my parents' rooms at night, etc. And the importance of taking just a deep breath and a step back and really hearing deeply what other people are saying and how their experiences how you and them can use your experiences to reach a compromise that works for everybody and make sure that everybody involved is as healthy as possible.
Great, thank you so much. And I think a lot of people can relate to those yelling matches that may happen. And so Eliza's Dear Parents Guide is one example of the sort of awareness building and education kind of campaigns that we have here today. And so Lars and Maddie, I know that a big part of both of your campaigns is focused on raising awareness about mental health and social media use in school. So Lars, I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit more about your Brain Health Bootcamp or your Brain Health for Schools initiatives and why you are focusing on educators and bringing this into schools as part of your work.
Yeah, I'd love to. So brainhealthbootcamp.org is an online resource for parents, students, and schools, which includes brain conditions, resources, stories, along with a guided program to teach people the basics of brain health. The mission is to make parents, students, and educators aware of brain health early on and promote early action. We really want to provide education pre-crisis. And the reason we're including educators is because brain health is largely absent from our education curriculum, although 76% of mental illness emerges in adolescence. And that's why it's so important to address it in schools. Many teachers also struggle with how to teach the material because it's a sensitive topic. So by providing vetted information, we hope to make brain health an easier subject to discuss and teach. And just to summarize, we're helping schools promote brain health content to their students and faculty with the Brain Health Bootcamp. We also want to raise awareness early with the goals of destigmatizing mental health, so rebranding it as brain health, educating people on mental illness, and getting the right resources for those who are struggling.
Thank you so much, Lars. That's important work, and it's really interesting to rebrand it to brain health. That does sound different and sounds more medical, and so that really is an interesting tactic. So good work. Maddie, I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about your No So November campaign and why you're trying to get schools to adopt it.
Yeah, of course. So No So November, it is going to be an educational challenge video with the intention to begin to bring the conversation about how social media apps are designed, kind of going off of what the social dilemma was promoting and explaining to kids, like, here's what's actually happening behind the scenes. Here's what you don't know about why you're so addicted, why your mental health is suffering through these apps. And I'm actually the director of the social dilemma. Jeff Orlowski will be featured in my video that will be shown in schools. So we have it's going to be around 10-minute clip of me and Jeff explaining sort of the problem, linking suicide and mental health issues with social media. And so for me, I think the most important thing is that this is not really something taught in high schools. And I think high school is the perfect time to strike, because I would say that's probably when kids begin using these apps more frequently and start realizing the issues. I know that was true for me and some of my friends. So yeah, my website is NoSo Novembers. That's short for No Social Media in November, because at the end of the video, we're gonna do a little call to action of if these impact you, these problems seem to impact you, we're gonna challenge you to take a full month off of social media to try to see how much it really does impact your mental health and see how much new free time you're gonna have once you log off. So the website is nosonovember.squarespace.com, which is in the link in the chat. We're trying to get this in high schools everywhere in the USA. So anyone who is interested, students or staff, we just need involvement to bring this challenge to the administration and schools so that we can have this be shown in schools to start the conversation and hopefully change students' relationship with these apps long term. So that's kind of the goal of my project. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Maddie. And yeah, and kind of raising awareness about this issue. Sometimes it is just best to start with yourself and just to notice how you feel when you take a break from some of these apps and platforms. So it's a really great challenge. So in addition to sort of, raising awareness and helping to destigmatize things, I am a little bit heartened that there does seem to be some policy momentum on this issue, and I'd love to talk about that a little bit. Bob, the UK just published the online harms bill, which would make big tech companies responsible for both preventing illegal content from being shared on their platforms and for protecting children from harmful content. So I'm wondering if you could tell me, what is the significance of this legislation, and is it a step in the right direction?
It's absolutely a step in the right direction, and it's really heartening. I think it's potentially groundbreaking globally. The online harms bill is actually part of a suite of 4 measures the UK government has undertaken this year. Think of it a bit like health and safety legislation for the internet. So we had the Industrial Revolution, then we had lots of factories full of dangerous machinery, and it took governments a while to catch up with the idea that employers should protect their employees from dangerous machinery. I think over the last 10 years, big techs have become dominant in our lives and regulation hasn't kept up. So what the online harms bill does, it says for the first time that big techs will now have a statutory duty of care to assess what harms their products and services might have, particularly on children and the vulnerable. And if they identify harms, which could include things like creating anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide, they have to take action to mitigate those harms. And Ofcom, which is our media regulator, every year will assess the big techs to see whether they think the actions they've taken is sufficient. And if it isn't, they will have the right to fine those companies very heavily. And I think that's a really good way of looking at the problem. It'll take a couple of years to see whether it works, but I think it's very significant. Just to very quickly touch on the other 3 measures, which are also, I think, quite significant. There is simultaneously an age-appropriate design code, which is saying to the software designers, if you are making a platform available to an under 13, you need to think very carefully about what's appropriate content for an under 13 and build that into the way you design your platform. The third thing is that in the national curriculum, which is what the government decrees that children have to learn at school, we will for the first time have something called relationship education. And that has a module in it which explains the difference between an online and an offline relationship. And it highlights the risks around some aspects of online relationships. So this is the first time we've done this in our schools. And then finally, picking up something that John mentioned earlier, we're creating a digital markets unit within our antitrust regulator, the Competitions and Markets Authority, which will be a specialist unit looking at how we can attack the monopolistic and monopsonistic positions of some of these very big dominant companies that have developed in the tech arena. So I think to answer your question, it is groundbreaking. It's the first in the world. I think it could have a very major impact. Eyes will be focused to see whether it works or not. And let's hope other governments copy.
Great, thank you so much. It's something that we're eyeing as well, and hopeful how the world responds. John, I know that on the US side of things, there seems to be increasing bipartisan momentum, as you mentioned earlier, especially around the issue, framing it as a public health issue and protecting kids. So what are some of the promising policy proposals that you're seeing?
Yeah, there are a couple of bills, but the one that kind of has the most momentum around it, I would say, is the KIDS Act. It was introduced last year by Senator Ed Markey, who's become sort of known as an ally on youth issues. And it would address a lot of all of the things that we've been talking about today. There are measures in it to ban quantified popularity, to ban autoplay features, push notifications, I think it addresses as well. It would put up some guardrails around the kinds of content that are being amplified, that young people are, that are being amplified on platforms that young people are using. And then it would also prohibit certain forms of manipulative marketing tactics, including, it mentions this in the bill, like influencer marketing. So the challenge to this, that you've got the political will, you've got actual legislation to organize around. The challenge right now is that you're in an environment, a legislative environment, a political environment where there are a lot of competing priorities right now, right? Like, we're coming out of the pandemic, we're dealing with economic recovery, infrastructure, student debt, you know, policing reform. Like, there are a lot of demands. And the reality of this is, lawmakers are not going to step away from those other priorities and make this a priority unless there's more public pressure. They need political cover, which is something, again, young people will have to lead.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving us a little summary of that landscape. Eliza, I know that you've also been looking at the KIDS Act as a call to action in one of your campaigns, the Technically Politics campaign. Can you tell the audience more about this project and why it's so important that lawmakers hear from young people directly?
Absolutely. Thank you, Julia. So Emma Lemke, who is the founder of the youth-led Log Off movement, which is an incredible movement. I recommend you all check it out. Emma Lemke and I were on a call at Center for Humane Tech and started talking about how we feel like there's a deficit in youth activism in the government area of technology, and how we are noticing this problem when we are living this problem, and yet I can't yet vote. A lot of my peers can't vote, and we certainly can't hold seats in government yet. But the things that are being created in our government in the US will have profound impacts on our lives and the lives of the future generations, and noticing that we should really have a say in what's happening in the decisions that are being made currently, as we're the ones that will be most affected by them. And so Emma and I came up with Technically Politics, which will be, we just launched it today, and we will have our official launch next week. So everyone who's attending today will get the more information about that later. But we'll be collecting testimonials from teenagers and youth around the country who have had own experiences with technology and really notice ways in which they want our digital spaces to change and to be made safer, and to put the users ahead of the companies, and make sure that those who are interacting with these spaces are in a safe space and aren't victims of things that are out of their control. And so by hearing these stories and by asking youth to say call to actions to lawmakers, and this is my experience and this is how you can help, we're hoping to add some more public pressure from those who are living through this problem, to really encourage lawmakers to side with us and galvanize this movement. And as Jon said, this is a bipartisan issue, and in a country in which so much weight is put on the younger generation, we're the future. I would hope that lawmakers are trying to protect us and promote our well-being in whatever way they can. And I think this is a huge element. So I'm really excited to see where this project goes. And I encourage all of the youth in the audience to upload a testimonial. It's just a short video. And all of the adults, your help is crucial in spreading the message and continuing to get the ball rolling on this, and make digital spaces safer, and have that be a top priority in the seats of our government.
Great. Thank you so much, Eliza. It's so important that they hear from you. I know just from our engagement with policymakers, they are craving these kinds of stories, and they really do have an impact, and they will cite them in hearings. And so it's a great project. Hannah, I'd love to turn to you. I know with your work on our Terms campaign, you're looking at tackling surveillance capitalism and the very systems that are putting a price tag on our mental health. Can you tell us more about your campaign, and how do you hope to mobilize young people to call for reform?
So yes, we are developing On Our Terms right now. It's a multimedia campaign from young people to young people, dedicated to kind of dismantle these regimes of power, aka surveillance capitalism, etc., from stripping agency from vulnerable groups for profit. And if corporations are actively utilizing intentional design to engineer our thoughts to match their agendas, we believe that the greatest form of resistance is to form and explore our identities as young people through the lens of race, gender, sexuality, design, and any other curiosities that we choose to explore. And most importantly, we would be thinking outside of these systems that these big tech companies or modern day settlers are actively pushing to strip users of human autonomy. But this kind of teeters to the question of whether or not to take the route of reform, either through legislation or just kind of working within the system, or to leave the system altogether. So we're just kind of having those internal conversations a lot nowadays. And so currently, tangibly, we want to just have a collective of conversations through podcasts, video essays, art installations, and we kind of almost want to act as the catalyst of starting young people's journeys. And I think Jon put it well when he said identity categorization, I think he said, but just a collective of these different pieces to start their journeys to figuring out who they want to be in their world and what truly matters to them, because that is ultimately going to be the biggest form of resistance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. That's very ambitious and awesome campaign that you have going on. Before I move back to the adult allies, I'd love to just go back. I know I asked Eliza earlier, just sort of like, what's it really like to grow up digital? And just, you know, thinking back through what everyone's been saying and what Jon was saying, how if my parents only knew and how lawmakers really don't know. I'm just wondering if each of you on the youth side could speak a little bit more about what it's really like growing up, having always been on these platforms, what life is like. So Maddie, I might start with you if you're ready. I know I'm throwing a bit of a curveball, so you can pass too.
Yeah, no worries. I think the biggest thing that sticks out to me is just the constant yearning for attention. It's almost like, what can I do to make everyone in my community like me and want to be friends with me? And it's like kind of all the problems that occur in high school, like with drama and like being popular and being likable and even being attractive to men or women. Like it's almost like you have to create yourself into this persona that you just need the most attention, even if it's not authentically you. As long as you're getting the most attention from those around you and you're doing the popular trends, you're following what's in right now, which it's crazy because these things have always been around, these problems, but it's just like social media just amplifies it times 10. You know, like I can imagine these problems were already there, but it's just like it just gets maximized so hard, and it's kind of scary to see people throw away their authentic selves just to really try to morph themselves into what they think others want to see. I think that's a big thing that's stuck out to me through the years.
Yeah, that's so true. And that idea of like morphing yourself to the idealized version that you post on social media, I think a lot of people can resonate with that. You know, actually, I thought I asked Eliza this, but I don't think I did. So Eliza, do you want to talk about what it's really like to grow up this way?
Absolutely. So I was born in 2003, which was right on the brink of this whole technological revolution. So I still remember my early years of iPhones didn't really exist and people would read books. And in the classroom, I didn't have an email account and Google Docs wasn't a thing. But during my formative teenage years, all of this came into fruition. And so noticing, I think it's the dependency of my peers and of myself on these devices, and our phone is like an extra limb. And if we don't have it, there's this panic that arises, and figuring out how do we still maintain and form genuine human connection and participate fully in life when we have this whole other world that still has weight and is really important in many ways in our pocket. And working to create that balance is really difficult, especially because we are the guinea pig generation and nobody really knows yet, and technology is constantly evolving. But there's this term digital native that insinuates that kids born during this era are automatically adept with all forms of technology. And evolutionary wise, humans have not reached this point of we're born and then automatically we know how to use a phone. It's a learned behavior. And so I think the way in which we learn how to interact with the digital world has a profound impact on how we carry ourselves with it and whether it has a beneficial or negative impact on us. So I think, again, it's different to the individual, but it's a challenge to be part of this generation and empowering to watch the change that everybody is pushing for and to know that we have power in this space and in making the things that we've struggled with not a problem for the following generations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eliza. Maddie, I think that you had something you wanted to follow up about, so go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, kind of going back to what I was saying with attention, kind of going back to a more personal note, some things that I experienced specifically with people in my life who committed suicide, the grief, the way that our community handled grief, and I wouldn't say just our community, I think social media just made this a problem, but it was almost like everyone was competing to see who had the most photos with the person who passed away. And like whoever had the most photos, whoever posted the most about them was the closest friend to them. Like my friend called it the grief Olympics because it truly turned into a competition of like, you got more attention if you were closer with the person. But the only way people could tell you were closer to that person is how many photos you had. So it was almost like, it's just this disgusting way of like, constant attention, you know, and it made on top of the complex feelings of grief, it made that grief and like needing that validation from people around you made it 10 times worse to deal with the death of these people. And then also going off of that, like I remember in 6th grade, me and my friends, we like unknowingly followed these like grungy self-harm accounts on Instagram that were glorifying like beautiful skinny women like cutting their wrists, and there was all these things that we should not have been exposed to at that age. And like, I can say that one of my friends who did end up committing suicide, she followed those accounts and we looked at those, and it was almost like again, an attention thing to be self-harming at such a young age in 6th grade. And like, as someone who struggled with depression since my early middle school years, like I can definitely tell that just kind of like, it just made it a lot harder for me to escape that mindset, you know, because social media just kind of follows it just follows you down a rabbit hole of whatever you've been viewing, and it kind of amplifies everything you've been viewing. So it's like these self-harm and depression things are following you, so it's harder to escape that. So those are just some personal experiences that are very kind of specific to my experience, but I think I'm assuming there's tons of stories from youth about all of these things that aren't really being shared. So that's why I'm really grateful for this platform to have this conversation about all these weird issues that are arising with social media. So yeah, those were kind of my other points.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, just the idea of having all that quantified, like your grief quantified as well. I've never really thought about it that way. Lars, I wonder, do you have anything to add about what it's like to grow up on these platforms, or anything that's resonating with that other people are talking about here?
Sorry, I think there's a little bit of lag there. So I think what's most concerning for me is when I am in school and I arrive to a class early, and, you know, I try, and I'm a very like personal guy. I'm always trying to talk to people and get to know them better. But so many students they use their phone as a way to disassociate themselves from like the real world and escape needing to talk to other people. And I think that using your phone as a way, like, you're so nervous about something, let me pull out my phone. I think it's totally the opposite of what we should be doing. I think that when people are in a cramp, or like they time crunch or something, anytime they get nervous or stressed out, the phone is always the result of that. And I think that the ironic part of that is that the phone is what induces so much stress and anxiety. And it's caught so many children in its web of just capturing them and constantly making them go back and forth between the phone. I don't know. It's all very concerning to look at. And when you take a step back and look at everything and really process what's going on, I think that when I watched The Social Dilemma, I agreed so much with everything that it was saying that I pulled like 5 or 10 of my friends apart, and I was like, we're going to watch this movie together, guys, right now, so that you guys can understand what you're doing on your phone. Because I know in my psych class, for example, we went over screen time with everyone in the class, and kids have 7 or 9 hours on their phone a day, and it's crazy. I mean, how can you have 24 hours in a day? The thought to even think that you could be spending 7 or 9 hours on your phone is just incredible. And there's sleep in there too, right? Like, what is happening? And so I think that it's all, there's so many signs that show how concerning the social media has made everything, and how there needs to be a change that's made. Otherwise, I can't even imagine continuing on in a world that social media is like the predominant force over everyone. So yeah.
It's a lot to think about. I can't imagine the pressures of that. Eliza, I know you wanted to add something. You want to jump in?
I agree with everything Lars was just saying. And when I returned home from the mountain school, I was walking through the halls between classes. And so there's kids going both ways, full hallways, and there was no noise except for footsteps. And everybody either had earbuds in or was texting. And it was jarring to think, here's a hallway full of humans that you could be talking to and smiling at, and no one was interacting. And our phones offer the sense of instant gratification and this escape from momentary discomfort that if you were to push through, maybe you would make a new friend. And to counter that story, last week I was taking an AP exam in school, and we had to all shut off our phones, and there was a glitch in the test. And so we paused, and kids were taking out books and reading and standing up and dancing and asking me if we can play hangman. And this is a room full of seniors that I have gone to school with for the past 12 years, and some of them had never talked to each other. And so I think there's this sense of beauty in putting away our devices and overcoming that discomfort, because that's so crucial. And I think that builds resilience and grit, and also opens up all of these doors that we just aren't aware of when we're constantly turning to our devices.
Well said. And I know that I even challenge myself sometimes, because sometimes if you're alone somewhere and you feel kind of awkward, it's just easy to look at your phone and try to go through that. But like, some of life needs to be awkward, and there needs to be pauses, and that's just living. And, you know, we don't really allow ourselves to do that because of these systems. Hannah, I don't know if you have anything else to add about just what it's like growing up this way with social media being so pervasive.
I think something that's particularly interesting when we're, you know, in the conversation of activism, there was this term going around last summer when I first saw that term, but it was called trauma porn. And it was just of basically describing the videos of hate crimes and police brutality, just one after another, and what that can do to a community that has kind of experienced this for a lifetime beyond social media. And I just thought that was really damaging, because, you know, Instagram is interesting and Twitter is also interesting, because for one moment it's a war, it's a shooting or something like that, and then the next post is, you know, someone posting a selfie at the beach. So then that kind of creates this desensitization towards violence, towards racism. And I thought it was really interesting that there was another term going around called like activism burnout. And I just thought like that was just so intriguing to me, because I mean, I don't know, I feel like for me, like my whole life has been about like, you know, just standing up for like myself and my peers and my family. And like, I don't know if there even is room for burnout, I guess, necessarily, but I feel like social media has created that outcome where like burnout is supposedly a thing for activists, but I really think the term should be like flipped around for the people that, you know, are affected in real life. And another point I wanted to bring up was, you know, beyond social media, because I mean, as we talk about technology, I know we can get very into the Instagrams and like Snapchats and everything, but you know, there's a lot of different forms of media, and there's like, I know that, you know, it's just really interesting to see this like kind of pipeline between minstrel shows and modern day digital blackface. And I've seen this kind of happen a lot on TikTok in particular during my personal usage, but it'll just be like, now it'll be kind of like voiceovers of just like utilizing like an increased usage of AAVE and like just language that shouldn't be used by non-Black people. And I thought that was really interesting because a lot of the times it's excused as language of the Gen Z when, you know, it's just kind of been co-opted by non-Black people. And I think that was really damaging because I mean, just now in the Saturday Night Live skit with Elon Musk, I know that was like a big discussion in current culture like topics because basically non-Black people kind of went on Saturday Night Live and did a skit, and it was just basically just utilizing AAV as humor. And yeah, I thought that was like just really interesting to see how you know, racist forms of media, like traditional media, is now translated onto the more modern day Instagrams that we see today. So that was just something that I wanted to point out.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I mean, you're right to think about all that. It's a really complex issue. Bob, I know that you've looked at a lot of these problems in your book, and I'm just wondering, you know, in your mind, how the role of artificial intelligence, how that's played in making youth get hooked on social media platforms.
So one of the big issues about AI is in a world where AI is going to dominate the future and basic jobs are going to disappear. So the jobs that are left are the more complex ones that only humans can do. Are we just at the moment when we need to teach our kids to be able to concentrate and focus on complex tasks so that they can undertake this complex work of the future? Are we in fact teaching them to multitask and to act, as I call them in the book, like digital bees that snack on multiple information pots, honeypots? Is that the right skill set for an age where actually what we need people to be able to do is to deep attend, deep listen, deep watch, focus and concentrate? That's kind of the big issue around AI, I think. I'm not sure whether that's what you meant, but that's what I take from your question.
No, that's really helpful, and to think of the sort of distraction crisis and how that all plays a role in this as well. John, I'm just wondering, you know, are these, what everyone's saying here on this panel, is this resonating what you've heard in your interviews? And was there anything else that you learned about kind of commodification and just the damaging effects of that?
Yeah, 100%. I think as Hannah was just talking about, there are other sort of forms of technology beyond social media. And I mentioned earlier, there was a third thing that came up as a universal pattern in our interviews. We haven't talked about dating apps, right? The conversation has focused solely on Facebook and Instagram, and rightly so. But when you're talking about specifically about teen mental health and identity formation, dating apps are playing a huge role in that process and in the ways that they're learning how to form intimate connections with each other. As Lars was talking about this as well, I started thinking about this. So there is, let me just start with a stat that over 50% of Tinder's users, for example, are Gen Z users, right? It's become so ubiquitous, so normalized, especially among younger generations. And what's really interesting is when you talk to people about their experience with technology, there's this feeling, and with these dating apps, there's this feeling of like, of being disposable and other people being disposable because they're being inundated with so many connections. So we looked into this a little bit, and why having access to more and more connections is actually making people feel less worthy and sort of less loved and less comfortable with intimacy. And it all comes down to the psychological phenomenon called the paradox of choice. And so basically, it's this was discovered in the context of like consumer decisions and like shopping, where we tend to think that the more options that we have, the more freedom we have, right? in reality, the more options you have, you can get to a point where you just can't make a decision, or you don't trust the decision that you make. It causes a lot of cognitive dissonance. So one example of this, there was an experiment where they had one group of shoppers sampled 26 jars of jam, and then another group that sampled only like 8. And the group that sampled more jars of jam reported less contentment with their decision. The group that sampled less were more confident in their decision. So this is happening with dating for young people right now. If they're afraid to form connections offline, they're turning to their phones to, you know, for the convenience of it, for the less awkward social interactions, but they're making connections, or at least performative connections, that just don't go anywhere. And then they internalize this, and they think, oh, what's wrong with me? Is it, am I not, you know, do I not have enough, am I not popular enough? Am I not fit enough, right? Because your dating accounts are linked to your social accounts. So you internalize this, you start objectifying yourself, you start taking it out on other people, and it creates this culture of loneliness. And the question is, who's benefiting from this system? Why does it keep continuing? Then you look at the profits of these dating app companies. I mean, they're making billions of dollars a year profiting off of people's loneliness, not just profiting off of loneliness, but manufacturing loneliness for profit. I mean, if you just look at dating apps now versus 5 years ago, there are so many products to boost your profile, to like send likes, send a rose, or whatever it is, you know? So they know what's going on. They know there's this inherent, you know, problem with the technology. And I didn't mention it earlier because I don't know what the legislative solution is to something like that. It's kind of a cultural thing we have to sit on for a second. But last thing I'll say, just kind of extending this, you also have, porn came up earlier on with Bob in the comments. We haven't even talked about OnlyFans, right? Like, in the same way, teens feel like they can't exist socially if they're not on social media. What happens 10 years from now as OnlyFans becomes normalized, where you can't exist sexually unless you're on OnlyFans, right? And you've got a dollar amount that people can see up front about what you're worth. You have tech companies commodifying human relationships, not just human relationships, but rendering human bodies as tokens of economic exchange, going back to Hannah's point about techno-capitalism. So there's all this to say, everything that everyone was talking about resonates completely with the dozens of other kids that we've been talking to, and there are a lot of platforms besides Facebook and Instagram that need to be part of the conversation as well.
Thank you so much for broadening the conversation. I mean, there is just a larger, all these platforms are contributing to this larger culture where we have to perform at all times and commodify everything. And you're right, we do internalize that. So yeah, thank you for expanding that. And I know I brought us down this sort of rabbit hole discussion again on the problems, but ultimately, you know, many of you are working on these solutions, and it will be the young people that are impacted by these very issues that are able to solve these problems. So before I turn it back to them, Bob, I know in your book, you mentioned that Gen Z needs to mount a revolution against the harms from technology and create the future they deserve. So based on everything we're hearing today and your research, are you hopeful that that will happen?
I'm not just hopeful, I'm absolutely certain. I'm certain from the 200 youngsters I met, and by the way, the hour I spent with them each day was always the best hour of every day. Their mature attitudes about society, their enthusiasm for solving societal problems was utterly intoxicating. You only have to listen to this panel that we've had tonight, which is just, I think, awesome in their ideas and their energy to have no doubt that Gen Z is going to solve this problem itself. If we don't solve it for them, which we really should be doing. Let me throw out a little challenge tonight. So if you look at the boards of Google and Facebook, it's pretty shocking. These are not companies, I think, that want challenge to their current business models. And I did have a little look at the board of Google, for example, and the average age of the employees, I think, is 29. Interestingly, the average age of the board of directors is 62. The youngest person on the board is 47. Every single person on that board is either very wealthy, or there is one person who is an academic, although she comes from a discipline which is microbiology, which I'm not sure has massive relevance to challenging Google's business model. It might be, you know, very interesting, but So where is the child development psychologist? Where is the ex-media regulator? And frankly, where is the Gen Z representative, right? Because I think if Google had some of the people we've heard from tonight on the board, they may have a slightly different attitude. So I'd like to throw out a challenge tonight, which is I think Google, you should hire Hannah and Eliza to join your board. And I think Facebook, you should have Lars and Maddie on your board. And then let's see how the discussion at the boardroom table goes around how these business models are going to develop in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. All right, well, let's turn to the audience Q&A. I know we have some questions that are surfacing here. So the first question from Sonia is, do you think K through 12 schools should stop using social media with students? I'll start with our Gen Z activists. Does anyone want to jump in on this one? Go for it, Lars.
So I think that if in a perfect world, yes, like totally. I think that if K through 12 weren't using social media, we would see so many less problems overall, and that would be incredible. I think that although what's really difficult through that is social media is something that isn't going to break down anytime soon, in terms of it's you know, it's ingrained in our whole generation's brains that is something to go to. And I think that small bits of regulating social media use and taking it in smaller chunks is the way that eventually we're going to find you know, a world where social media can be beneficial but not overwhelming. And I think that there are so many aspects of just online behavior that is great, like service apps, Uber, and all of these things that are not really hurting you as a person. But when it comes to social media, I think that there's a whole nother story. I think that it's really difficult to decipher what is and what isn't healthy. Obviously, none of it is healthy at all in general, but like a healthy dose of being able to be in the social norm while also, you know, being in control of yourself and not letting social apps take control over you. So I think that it's something that needs to be taken in small chunks to find what is that happy medium of we're using social media as a positive thing and it's not overtaking our lives.
I love that. I really resonate with that. I know one of our taglines in the film are the platforms that connect us also control us. Eliza, I know you have some thoughts on this as well. Would you like to jump in?
Sure, thank you, Julia. And I think that schools are in this really unique position where there's an opportunity to teach youth how to interact with these platforms in a healthy way. And like Lars said, it's really difficult to disconnect social media from school. And because it's such a pervasive element of our life, in many ways, it's a necessity for schools to have this online platform. And so then comes in, okay, teachers and individuals can teach youth how to engage with these sites in a way that's healthful and promotes learning. And there's space for curriculum to be developed. And that, along with maybe health and wellness curriculum, there's a segment on using social media and even using the Google Classroom platform in a way that's conducive to overall well-being. So I think this is an area in which more eyes are on it now. And how can we channel the power of schools, and especially of public schools where there's a standardized curriculum, to enhance the learning of youth, both online and offline.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if we have any thoughts on what age we should start explaining to children how to use powerful tech devices that are influencing their minds and bodies. This is a question, I believe, from Beverly. Bob, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and if not, I can...
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, the American Pediatric Association has published some pretty detailed guidelines about the ages at which kids should have particular kinds of devices and how much time they should be allowed on screen per day. So it's worth looking at that. I think I noticed in that question there was a reference specifically to porn, so we have to pick up on that. If the average start age for porn watching is 11, the average, that means some people are starting at 8, 9. I fear, sadly, we need to start talking to kids pretty young about this stuff. You know, in the book, I've got all the APA guidelines. You can see it there. You can go to the APA website and read it. But I'm afraid it's younger and younger, because 42% of under 8s in the US now have a tablet, as one academic put it. Preschool children taken to tablets like ducks to water. And if you have a tablet, you've probably got access to a lot of age inappropriate content. One other quick thing, if I may, we tend to engage with our children on their offline lives. So we say, what are we doing today? And, oh, I went to the park and I played football with John, or I met Brian, we played tennis, right? What we don't tend to do, at least I speak as maybe as a failed parent in this respect, is to say, okay, but between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. in the morning, on the 3 hours that you spent on Snapchat and Instagram, scrolling through social media and chatting to friends, just a matter of interest, kind of roughly speaking, you know, what were you talking, what kind of issues came up, who were you talking to, how was it? And we think that's prying. I would say a lot of kids don't particularly see that as prying. It's just the world they live in, and they wouldn't actually see any difference between you asking what you were doing when you went to the park as opposed to being on the internet. So my one piece of advice for parents is absolutely engage yourself in your children's online lives. To the extent that you have the knowledge to be able to do so. That's another question, right, for some of us, but I really think we need to get in with our kids and understand what they're doing on screen, because it's not screen time, it's what they're doing when they're on screen that matters. And that way you may be able to help explain some of the risks and dangers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. This is a follow-up question that might be good for you as well before I turn it back to the others. Sonia had a question about, where did age 13 come from as the magical age for allowing youth to have social media accounts, especially when it's filled with porn and strangers? So do you have any additional thoughts on that?
I have no idea where 13 came from. So the interesting issue here is how you know a child, if you're a social media platform, how you know how old a child is, right? And so we have this bizarre concept that we don't allow our children to go and buy alcohol without ID cards or some kind of ID. You can't travel on a plane without ID. You can't gamble without ID, right? But we allow everyone to roam around the internet, whether they're a child or an adult, without identifying themselves, at least identifying themselves as to their age. Now, whoever thought that was a good idea? Because what happens, I'm afraid the surveys show, is that children repeatedly lie about being over 13 when they're not. And sadly, lots of parents aid and abet their children in that lie by either allowing them to lie or actually supporting when the platform comes to the parent and says, is your child over 13, confirming that they are. So I think we have to do away with anonymity on the web. And why is that so important? Well, it's important for the following reason. If the platform doesn't know who you actually are, right, and you engage in one of the worst kinds of behaviors like cyberbullying or hate speech or fake news, or God forbid, child grooming, and another user who's a victim of your activities decides to complain about you to the platform, if the platform doesn't know who you are, they can't do anything about it. They might be able to take down your profile and perhaps potentially for a limited period stop you setting up another one from the same email address or IP platform, but that's not going to take you long to circumvent. But if the platform knows who you are, they can report you to law enforcement, and we can see some action. And I think if you did that, 80% of the bad behavior on the internet in those categories that I've identified would stop overnight.
Great, thank you so much for that. And I know Pamela has been active in our Q&A and, you know, recommends that adult allies need to stand up more for kids, and that it needs to be, you know, on us to be doing this work. We're putting a lot on kids. So I do think that's a great point. And I wanted to turn, I know that, I think, John, that you just answered that question. All right, we'll move along.
I can answer it probably if it's helpful.
Yeah, why don't you answer that? Because it just moved from my screen,
yeah,
but why don't you say, you remember the question? Go ahead.
Yeah, the question from Ali was, is there any way to persuade social media companies to apply an ethical outlook? And the answer is yes. There are 3 things that we can do. The first is contact your senator to push for regulation. We talked about the Kids Act today in the US. The second is demanding universities change their computer science curriculums and adopt humane tech curriculum. So this does two things, keeping in mind that these social media companies, they get all their talent from like a handful of big tech universities. So this trains new tech workers to not only change companies like Facebook from the inside out, but it also, more importantly, creates a new generation of technologists who can say, I don't want to go work at Facebook. I'm going to create a competing platform instead with a much better business model that can supplant Facebook the way Facebook supplanted MySpace. And then the third is to increase public pressure, right? Like the two big things I'm telling people to do right now is just share your story at socialtruth.humanetech.com. They're sending those stories, especially young people. If you have stories, like go to socialtruth.humanetech.com. They're sending those stories to lawmakers directly. And I'm also really interested in the work like that Maddie is doing, that Hannah are doing, especially leading the mass detox movement. Like this idea of turning social media detoxes, which we usually do individually for our own mental health, turning that into collective action is a really interesting idea and an early form of like protest that we're starting to see on the youth movement front.
Great, thank you so much. And I do think hitting the tech talent pipeline is an effective strategy. I have another question from Theodora that I think would be really great for our youth panelists. She says that we often hear that the younger generations today don't make the distinction between in real life and online life. It is one and the same. Do you believe that it would be beneficial to your generation and those younger than you to create that distinction? And what do you think is the most effective way of doing that? Does anyone feel compelled to jump in? Go for it, Hannah.
I don't know how directly this would answer the question, but I think we're kind of in a space where we could kind of mesh that online and real life conversation really beautifully. And I know we always kind of might come to the conclusion of, oh, just like turn your phones off, turn the notifications off. But I think that also contributes to somehow placing the blame on the user. And we definitely don't want to do that because it doesn't address the root issue. But I would say that a really great way that you can kind of connect an online conversation and a real life task together is to kind of decolonize your consumption of media. So for me, I think this would be reading. And I know that Bob really mentioned that for child development, like how important reading is. And No Name, like a rapper, and she leads this No Name book club in online spaces and in-person spaces, but she was saying that reading is a critical part of liberation and developing solidarity. And, you know, if you kind of want to, and so I thought like her like No Name book club was just so beautiful because they have discussions on Zoom, but then they're kind of reading like on their own, and they're coming back and just having like real life conversations. And I think that's a really good way of doing that to answer Theodora's question. But also I kind of wanted to mention like a couple other things just while I'm at it. But a question that Jonathan Rosenthal brought up in one of our panel discussions that we had like internally a couple days ago that I thought was interesting to ask yourself would be, you know, if we're talking about activism and allyship, and just to kind of question like where it's coming from. And I know that Jonathan was sharing his story about, you know, like questioning whether or not his activism was coming from a fantasy for doing good or keeping high morals of some sort, or if you're kind of just genuinely standing in solidarity with like groups affected by different issues. And if it is the prior, it's important to recognize that, you know, true allyship is not speaking over marginalized voices and to keep yourself and your own people accountable. And I think that can be done through these online and real life conversations meshed together. And I just had a response to what Bob just previously said about the identification. I just kind of wanted to challenge a little bit. When we say identification, I was just kind of wondering what this would mean for like undocumented citizens and youth in particular. And when we kind of turn these like online, I thought it was a really interesting solution to like online kind of hate people and racism on like these online platforms, but like I would personally feel even more unsafe knowing that like our identities could be like turned over to law enforcement, especially as, you know, sexual violence cases and like rape cases kind of don't get handled well by law enforcement, as I've seen, and same with just like police brutality that we've seen against communities of color. So I was wondering how that would kind of be addressed in that solution, because those were concerns that I was thinking about.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. Such a complex issue. And I really appreciate your thoughts. And unfortunately, we are just about at time. So I'm wondering if, you know, we can just kind of wrap before we move on. I know we have a lot of some calls to action to share with you all, but I'm just wondering on the youth side, why does this movement need to be led by youth? And anyone can jump in, or I can call someone if need be.
I mean, as been mentioned before, truly no one from like other generations have lived through this, have like grown up. Like personally, I'm 19 years old. Social media was brought into my life right in the prime years of middle school, and that is an experience that is very, very unique. And I think, I mean, I personally believe that has contributed to the mass amount of suicides that we've been seeing, not only in my community but just everywhere. I think it's just so crucial. It's like, we know exactly what it was like growing up and how complex it was. And so personally, I believe that we're the ones who will know how to target these solutions toward these problems in ways that actually solve the problem. I think someone mentioned earlier, like if older people are making these, like in legislation, if they're changing the way that these platforms work, and they have good intentions, it might not work the way that they intend to. It might not be actually tackling the issues that are important to be tackling because they didn't live through it. They think they have, and I'm sure a lot of people are very educated on these issues, but having firsthand experience, like, it's so crucial to actually understanding what needs to be done. And so I think that's why it's really crucial for youth voices to be amplified.
That is so well said, Maddie. And I just think that that's so important that you brought that up. And I know we're at time, but I've been so inspired by everything that you all have said. And I know that many of you have lots of ways for us to take action. So I'll turn it directly over to Jean Rogers, who's the director of the Children's Screen Time Action Network, who can help kick us off with what we can all do after this really important and engaging conversation.
Thanks so much, Julia. It's been really moving and inspiring to be here with all of you today and to hear our teens and also the adult allies, because that's how we're going to get this done. And we have a slide, I think, with some various ways that we can take action. If you were also inspired by what you heard today, use the social dilemma and the wonderful mental health resources that are there. We have used them to start dialogues on these important topics, and it's a great way to be able to facilitate a conversation in any environment that you're in. Prioritize brain health, a new language that we learned today. We learned to call it brain health from Lars, and check out the Bjork Foundation. Join us at the Children's Screen Time Action Network. We're a collaborative community of educators, professionals, parents, and advocates working together to advocate for change. And we have a new work group called the Cyberbullying and Online Safety Group, which is addressing many of these issues that people might be interested in joining. Share your story. It's so important. Storytelling is what is going to help these issues get resolved.
Great. Thank you so much, Jean. And thank you to all of our panelists and sponsors for this wonderful event today. I know that I feel very inspired to take action. I'm glad that we have a few discrete things we can even do today. So yeah, thank you all for joining. And unless Susan or Julie, there's anything else, I think we can call it here.